The sun was setting as Captain Elaine Marshall drove home after a long day at work. She was tired but happy with what she had done that day. As the newly appointed Deputy Commissioner of Internal Affairs, she had many important jobs to do. Today, she had finished reviewing officer complaint files and had led a meeting about making the police force better. Elaine was 45 years old and had worked as a police officer for 20 years. She had earned every promotion through hard work and doing the right thing. Now, she was one of the highest-ranking black women in the entire police department. But today, she wasn't wearing her uniform or badge. She had changed into regular clothes, jeans, and a simple blue sweater, before driving home in her personal car, a black sedan that was 5 years old. The streets were quiet as she drove through town. Elaine thought about stopping to get dinner, but decided to just go home and make something simple instead. She was looking forward to a quiet evening with a good book and maybe calling her daughter who was away at college. As she turned onto Maple Avenue, just 3 miles from her house, bright flashing lights suddenly appeared in her rearview mirror. Elaine checked her speed. She was going exactly the speed limit. She hadn't run any stop signs or made any illegal turns. Confused but calm, she put on her turn signal and pulled over to the right side of the road. What could this be about? She wondered as she turned off her music and rolled down her window. In her rearview mirror, she could see a white police officer getting out of his patrol car. He walked slowly toward her vehicle, one hand resting on his gun holster. Elaine recognized this as unnecessary for a simple traffic stop. The officer, whose name tag read Reynolds, stopped beside her window. He was young, probably in his late 20s, with a serious face that showed no friendliness. "License and registration," he said sharply, not bothering to say hello or explain why he had pulled her over. Elaine knew proper police procedure. Officers were supposed to identify themselves and explain the reason for a stop. She smiled politely and asked, "Good evening, officer. May I ask why you pulled me over?" Officer Reynolds frowned. His voice became harder. "I said license and registration, ma'am." He emphasized the word ma'am in a way that didn't sound respectful. Elaine kept her voice calm and steady. "I understand, officer. I'm happy to provide those, but I'd like to know the reason for the stop first, please." The officer's face changed. He looked angry now. "Are you refusing to comply with my orders?" "Not at all," Elaine said. "I'm simply asking for the reason for the traffic stop, as is my right." Officer Reynolds leaned down, looking into her car. His eyes moved over her, taking in her appearance. "Let me guess. You think you know the law better than I do?" Elaine noticed 2 people walking on the sidewalk had stopped to watch. One had taken out a phone and appeared to be recording. She knew this situation could quickly get worse. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Reynolds suddenly ordered. "May I ask why that's necessary?" Elaine asked, still keeping her voice calm. "Because I said so," he snapped. "Step out now, or I'll have to remove you myself." Elaine could feel her heart beating faster, but her face remained composed. She had been in difficult situations before. As she carefully unbuckled her seatbelt, she thought about the irony. Just hours ago, she had been reviewing cases of officer misconduct, and now she was experiencing it firsthand. What Officer Reynolds didn't know was that he had just stopped the wrong person. The woman he was treating poorly wasn't just any driver. She was his boss's boss's boss. Elaine slowly opened her car door and stepped out. The evening air felt cool as she stood straight, facing Officer Reynolds. She was not tall, but she carried herself with dignity. Years of police work had taught her how to stay calm in tense situations. "Stand over here," Officer Reynolds ordered, pointing to the space between their 2 cars. His hand was still close to his gun, a detail Elaine noticed right away. More cars were slowing down now. Some drivers looked quickly and drove on, but others pulled over across the street. There were at least 5 people watching, and 3 had phones out, recording everything. "Officer Reynolds," Elaine said calmly, reading his name tag again, "I still don't understand why you pulled me over. Could you please explain?" The officer's face turned red. "You were swerving," he claimed. Elaine knew this wasn't true. She had been driving perfectly. "I don't believe I was swerving, sir. I was driving carefully and following all traffic rules." "Are you calling me a liar?" he asked, stepping closer to her. "No, sir. I'm simply stating what I know to be true about my own driving." Elaine kept her voice level, though inside she was growing more concerned. This officer seemed determined to create a problem where none existed. "Let me see your license now," he demanded. Elaine nodded. "My purse is in the car. May I reach for it?" Slowly, he warned. As she turned to get her purse, Officer Reynolds spoke again. "You people always think you can talk your way out of trouble." Elaine froze for a second. "Excuse me? What do you mean by you people?" Officer Reynolds crossed his arms. "You know exactly what I mean. People who think they're too important to follow the rules. People who think they know more than the police." But his tone and the look in his eyes told Elaine he meant something else entirely. A car humped as it passed by. Someone called out, "Leave her alone." From a passing vehicle, the crowd across the street had grown to about 8 people now. Elaine carefully reached into her car and took out her purse. As she opened it, she made a decision. Inside were 2 sets of identification, her regular driver's license and her police ID that showed her rank as deputy commissioner. Officer Reynolds was watching her closely. "Hurry up," he said. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Elaine began. "The only misunderstanding is you thinking you can waste my time," he interrupted. "Just because you're driving a nice car doesn't mean you're above the law." Elaine took a deep breath. The situation was getting worse, and she needed to end it before something serious happened. "Are you on something?" Officer Reynolds suddenly asked, leaning in to look at her eyes. Your pupils looked dilated. This false accusation was the final straw. "No, Officer Reynolds, I am completely sober, and I think it's time I introduced myself properly." She pulled out her police ID instead of her driver's license. But before she could show it to him, Officer Reynolds grabbed her wrist. "What are you reaching for?" he demanded. "My identification," Elaine said firmly. "Please release my wrist." "Don't tell me what to do," he said, tightening his grip slightly. Across the street, someone shouted, "Hey, you can't treat her like that." Officer Reynolds glanced at the growing crowd, looking annoyed. His radio crackled, and a voice asked if everything was okay at his location. "Just dealing with an uncooperative subject," he replied into his shoulder radio. Elaine stayed perfectly still. "Officer Reynolds, you are currently holding the wrist of the Deputy Commissioner of Internal Affairs. I suggest you let go immediately." His face showed confusion. "What did you say?" "My name is Captain Elaine Marshall. I am the Deputy Commissioner of Internal Affairs for this police department." Her voice was quiet but powerful. "And you have just made a very serious mistake." The color drained from Officer Reynolds' face as he slowly released her wrist. Across the street, the crowd had gone silent, everyone watching intently. Elaine held up her police ID, the gold badge gleaming in the fading sunlight. Officer Reynolds stared at the badge and ID in Elaine's hand. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The confident, aggressive officer from moments ago was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he had just seen a ghost. "Deputy Commissioner?" he finally managed to say. "That's correct," Elaine replied calmly. "I run internal affairs for the entire department." For those watching, the change in the officer's behavior was dramatic. He stepped back quickly and straightened his uniform. His hand, which had been near his gun throughout the stop, now hung nervously at his side. I didn't recognize you, ma'am," Officer Reynolds stammered. "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Elaine put her ID back in her purse. "This wasn't a misunderstanding, Officer Reynolds. This was a clear violation of department policy. You failed to identify yourself or state the reason for the stop. You made inappropriate comments. You escalated a routine situation unnecessarily. And you put your hands on me without cause." The small crowd across the street had grown to about 15 people. Some were still recording with their phones. A few were nodding as Elaine spoke. Officer Reynolds looked around nervously. "Ma'am, perhaps we could discuss this in private." "No, I don't think so," Elaine said. "You didn't choose to handle this matter privately when you decided to treat me disrespectfully in public." She turned to look at her car. "Now, please explain to me and everyone watching what traffic violation I committed." Officer Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "I thought I observed your vehicle swerving, ma'am." "Did you? Let's check." Elaine gestured to his patrol car. "Your dashboard camera should have recorded this alleged swerving. Shall we review the footage together?" The officer's face went pale. They both knew the camera would show no such thing. Just then, another police car pulled up. A middle-aged man with sergeant stripes on his uniform stepped out. His name tag read Sergeant Miller. "Everything okay here?" he asked, looking between Elaine and Officer Reynolds. Officer Reynolds looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. "Sergeant Miller," Elaine said with a nod. "I'm Deputy Commissioner Marshall. There seems to be a situation with one of your officers." The sergeant's eyes widened in recognition. He immediately straightened his posture. "Deputy Commissioner Marshall, I didn't expect. What happened here?" Elaine explained the situation briefly. With each detail, Sergeant Miller's expression grew more concerned. He turned to Officer Reynolds with a look that could have melted steel. "Reynolds, wait in your patrol car. Now." His voice left no room for argument. As Officer Reynolds walked away, head down, the sergeant turned back to Elaine. "Ma'am, I want to personally apologize for my officer's conduct. This is completely unacceptable." "Yes, it is," Elaine agreed. "And it makes me wonder how Officer Reynolds treats civilians when they don't turn out to be his superior." The crowd across the street had started to disperse, though a few people remained, still watching and recording. "I want a full report on my desk by tomorrow morning," Elaine told the sergeant. "Include the dashboard camera footage, Officer Reynolds' record, and any previous complaints against him." Sergeant Miller nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am, right away." Elaine looked over at Officer Reynolds sitting in his patrol car. His face was visible through the windshield, looking stressed and afraid. She thought about all the people who experienced unfair treatment during traffic stops, but didn't have the power of a badge to protect them. "Sergeant," she said, "I believe this incident presents us with an opportunity." "Ma'am." "An opportunity to address what appears to be a significant training issue within the department." Elaine's voice was firm but not angry. "And perhaps a chance for Officer Reynolds to learn a valuable lesson." The sergeant looked relieved that she wasn't immediately calling for Officer Reynolds to be fired. "What do you have in mind, Deputy Commissioner?" The next morning, Elaine sat in her large office at police headquarters. The wall behind her desk had framed certificates and awards from her 20 years of service. On her desk was a photo of her daughter in a college graduation gown, smiling proudly. Elaine was reading a thick folder. Inside were Officer Reynolds' records and several complaint forms. She frowned as she turned each page. A knock at the door interrupted her reading. "Come in," she called. Sergeant Miller entered, looking nervous. He carried another folder under his arm. "Good morning, Deputy Commissioner. I have the report you asked for." Elaine motioned to the chair across from her desk. "Have a seat, Sergeant." As he sat down, she held up the folder she had been reading. "I've been reviewing Officer Reynolds' file. Did you know he has had 7 civilian complaints in just 3 years on the force?" Sergeant Miller looked uncomfortable. "Yes, ma'am, but none of them were officially confirmed." "None were officially confirmed," Elaine repeated slowly. "And why do you think that is?" The sergeant shifted in his seat. "Well, ma'am, it's often one person's word against an officer's, and without clear evidence." Elaine held up her hand to stop him. "Let me share something with you, Sergeant. Before yesterday, I was just a name and title to Officer Reynolds. He had never met me, yet the way he treated me during that traffic stop was unprofessional from the very beginning." She leaned forward. "Now imagine how he treats people when no one is watching, people who don't have a badge or authority." Sergeant Miller nodded slowly. "I understand your concern, ma'am." "Good, because this isn't just about one officer. This is about a culture that allows such behavior." Elaine stood up and walked to the window. Outside, she could see officers coming and going from the building. "I've made a decision," she said. "I'm not going to fire Officer Reynolds." The sergeant looked surprised. "You're not?" "No, firing him would be easy, but it wouldn't solve the bigger problem." She turned back to face him. "Instead, I have something else in mind." She outlined her plan. Officer Reynolds would be temporarily reassigned to work with community outreach programs in neighborhoods with mostly Black and Hispanic residents. He would partner with Officer Tamika Johnson, a respected Black officer with 15 years of experience. "Officer Johnson has an excellent record of community policing," Elaine explained. "She can show Officer Reynolds a different way to approach the job." "And what about his regular patrol duties?" Sergeant Miller asked. "He's suspended from patrol for 30 days, During that time, he'll attend additional training on racial bias and proper traffic stop procedures. Elaine's voice was firm, and I will be personally monitoring his progress. The sergeant nodded, looking relieved that the punishment wasn't worse. I'll inform him right away. There's more, Elaine said. I want all officers in your precinct to review the department's guidelines on traffic stops, and I want dashboard camera footage from every stop to be reviewed regularly. That's a lot of footage to review, ma'am. Then assign more people to review it, Elaine said simply. This isn't just about punishing one officer. It's about making sure all officers understand that they serve the entire community, not just parts of it. She looked at the clock on her wall. Officer Reynolds should be arriving soon. I want to speak with him personally. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. Her assistant's voice came through the speaker. Deputy Commissioner, Officer Reynolds is here to see you. Send him in, Elaine said. The door opened slowly. Officer Reynolds entered, looking very different from the confident, aggressive man from the day before. He was clean-shaven, his uniform perfectly pressed. His eyes were down, not meeting Elaine's gaze. Officer Reynolds, she said, please have a seat. We have a lot to discuss about your future with this department. Officer Reynolds sat stiffly in the chair, his hands resting on his knees. The large office made him look small. On the wall behind Elaine were photos of her shaking hands with the mayor and the police chief. Do you know why you're here, Officer Reynolds? Elaine asked, her voice calm but serious. Yes, ma'am, he replied quietly, because of my conduct during yesterday's traffic stop. Elaine nodded. That's part of it, but we're also here because of these. She pushed the folder of complaints across the desk toward him. 7 complaints in 3 years. That's a problem. Officer Reynolds looked at the folder but didn't touch it. Those complaints weren't confirmed, he said, a hint of his old defensiveness returning. Not confirmed doesn't mean not true, Elaine replied. It often means there wasn't enough evidence, or that the system protected you. She watched as his face showed a mix of emotions, anger, fear, and something else. Shame, perhaps. Tell me something, Officer Reynolds. Why did you become a police officer? The question seemed to surprise him. He hesitated before answering. To serve and protect. To make a difference. And who are you serving and protecting? The community, he said automatically. Which community? Elaine pressed. Officer Reynolds looked confused. The whole community. Elaine leaned forward. Yesterday, did you treat me like I was part of the community you serve? There was a long silence. Finally, he shook his head. No, ma'am. And if I hadn't been a deputy commissioner, if I had just been an ordinary citizen, what might have happened? Officer Reynolds looked down at his hands. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. They both knew things could have gone much worse. Elaine stood up and walked around her desk. She sat in the chair next to Reynolds, turning to face him directly. I could fire you today, she said, and part of me thinks I should. His face went pale, but he nodded slightly, as if accepting this fate. But I'm not going to, Elaine continued. Instead, I'm going to give you a chance to become the officer you said you wanted to be, the one who truly serves and protects the whole community. She explained the same plan she had told Sergeant Miller. Reynolds would be suspended from regular patrol duties for 30 days. During that time, he would work with Officer Johnson in community outreach programs and attend special training. Officer Johnson is one of our best, Elaine said. She knows how to police with respect and dignity. You'll learn from her. Officer Reynolds looked up, surprise clear on his face. You're giving me another chance. I'm giving you an opportunity to grow, Elaine corrected him. Whether you take it seriously is up to you. She stood and walked back to her chair behind the desk. There's one more thing. The videos. Videos? Reynolds asked, though he clearly knew what she meant. Yes, several people recorded our interaction yesterday. Those videos are already online. One has over 50,000 views. Officer Reynolds closed his eyes briefly, the reality of his public mistake sinking in. People are angry, Elaine continued. They're demanding you be fired. And you're not going to? There was disbelief in his voice. No, because firing you doesn't solve the real problem. But I need to know if you understand what the real problem is. Officer Reynolds was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice low but clear. I treated you differently because of how you look. I made assumptions. I was wrong. Elaine nodded slowly. That's a start. She picked up her phone. Send Officer Johnson in, please. The door opened, and a tall black woman in uniform entered. Officer Tamika Johnson had a confident walk and intelligent eyes. She nodded respectfully to Elaine, then turned her gaze to Officer Reynolds. Officer Johnson, Elaine said, meet your new partner for the next month. Officer Reynolds felt uncomfortable in the passenger seat of the patrol car. He was used to driving, being in control. But today, Officer Johnson was behind the wheel, and they were headed to the Riverside neighborhood, an area that was mostly black and Hispanic. We're going to the community center first, Officer Johnson explained as she drove. Her voice was businesslike, but not unfriendly. They have a youth program there. Kids need to see police officers as people they can trust, not fear. Reynolds nodded but said nothing. He was still thinking about his meeting with Deputy Commissioner Marshall. The shame of that traffic stop still burned in his stomach. Officer Johnson glanced at him. You're not here to be punished, Reynolds. You're here to learn. Feels like punishment, he muttered. That attitude won't help, she replied calmly. The people we're about to meet, they're good people. They want the same things you do. Safe neighborhoods, good schools, respect. They pulled up to a brick building with a colorful mural on its side. Children were playing basketball on a court nearby. When they saw the police car, several of them stopped and stared. They don't look happy to see us, Reynolds observed. They don't know us yet, Johnson replied. That's about to change. Inside the community center, a group of teenagers sat in a circle. A man named Mr. Washington led the group. He smiled when Officer Johnson entered. Officer Johnson. Good to see you again, he said warmly. Then his eyes moved to Reynolds. His smile faded slightly. And who's this? This is Officer Reynolds. He'll be working with me for the next month. Mr. Washington nodded but didn't offer his hand. Reynolds could feel the teenagers watching him, their eyes suspicious. We're just talking about interactions with police, Mr. Washington explained. Maybe you two would like to join our conversation. The teenagers looked uncomfortable. One boy, about 16 years old, spoke up. My cousin got stopped by police last week. He was just walking home from work. They made him sit on the curb for 20 minutes while they checked if he had warrants. He didn't do anything wrong. Reynolds felt his face grow hot. Before he could speak, another teenager, a girl with braided hair, added, My dad tells me to always keep my hands visible if police stop me, even if I'm just walking to school. Officer Johnson nodded. That's actually good advice, but it's sad that it's necessary. She looked at Reynolds. What do you think, Officer Reynolds? All eyes turned to him. Reynolds suddenly felt very exposed. These weren't criminals or troublemakers. They were just kids, looking at him with a mix of curiosity and wariness. I think, he began, then paused. I think police officers should treat everyone with respect. Always. The words felt hollow even as he said them. A boy in the back scoffed. Easy to say, the boy commented. Harder to do, right? Reynolds met the boy's eyes. You're right. It is harder to do. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. For the next hour, Reynolds mostly listened. The teenagers talked about their experiences and fears. Officer Johnson shared stories of her own, both good and bad interactions with fellow officers. Reynolds was surprised by her honesty. As they left the community center later, Reynolds was quiet again. What are you thinking? Officer Johnson asked as they got back into the patrol car. I'm thinking about what that kid said, about his cousin being made to sit on the curb. Reynolds looked out the window. I've done that. Made people wait while I run checks, even when they weren't doing anything suspicious. Officer Johnson nodded. Awareness is the first step. To what? To change. She started the car. We're heading to Ms. Garcia's house next. She runs a neighborhood watch program. She's been waiting to meet you. Reynolds looked surprised. Waiting to meet me? Why? Officer Johnson smiled slightly. Deputy Commissioner Marshall called her yesterday, told her all about you. 3 weeks had passed since Officer Reynolds began his new assignment. The weather had turned cooler, and leaves were starting to change color. Reynolds was standing outside the Riverside Community Center, helping children hang posters for an upcoming neighborhood safety fair. Officer Reynolds, is this straight? Asked Maria, a 10-year-old girl with bright eyes and 2 long braids. Reynolds stepped back to look at the poster. Perfect, Maria. Good job. He smiled as he watched the children work. 3 weeks ago, they had been afraid to talk to him. Now they called him by name and asked for his help. Inside the community center, Officer Johnson was talking with Mr. Washington. Through the window, they could see Reynolds with the children. He's different, Mr. Washington observed. When he first came here, that man was stiff as a board. Wouldn't look anyone in the eye. Officer Johnson nodded. He's learning. Reynolds had indeed changed over the past weeks. After his first difficult day at the community center, he had met Ms. Garcia, who ran the neighborhood watch program. Instead of judging him, she had welcomed him into her home and told stories about the neighborhood, both its challenges and its strengths. He had attended training sessions on bias and proper police procedures. At first, he had been defensive, but slowly he began to listen and understand. Most importantly, he had spent time with people, real people with names and faces and stories. People he might have once viewed with suspicion during a traffic stop. Later that afternoon, Reynolds and Johnson were called to help at a minor car accident. No one was hurt, but the drivers were arguing loudly about who was at fault. I'll handle this, Reynolds said confidently as they arrived. Officer Johnson stood back and watched as Reynolds approached the scene. One driver was a young black man, the other was an older white woman. This guy came out of nowhere, the woman was saying angrily. You must have been speeding. I was not speeding, the young man argued. You didn't use your turn signal. Reynolds greeted both drivers calmly. Is anyone hurt? That's the most important thing. Both drivers shook their heads. Good. Now, let's talk about what happened, Reynolds said. He listened carefully to both stories, treating each driver with the same respect. There was no hint of the bias he had shown during that traffic stop with Deputy Commissioner Marshall. As they were finishing up the accident report, the young man said to Reynolds, Thanks, officer. I thought you were going to just take her side. Reynolds looked surprised. Why would I do that? The young man shrugged. It happens. Not today, Reynolds said firmly. Not with me. Back in the patrol car, Officer Johnson looked at Reynolds with approval. You handled that well. I did my job, Reynolds replied simply. Yes, you did. The right way. Johnson smiled. The deputy commissioner wants to see you tomorrow. Reynolds felt his stomach tighten. Why? Did I do something wrong? No. Your 30 days are almost up. She wants to discuss your future assignment. That night, Reynolds sat at his kitchen table, thinking about the past month. He had entered this assignment angry and resentful. He had seen it as punishment. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. He picked up his phone and opened the video that had gone viral, the one showing his traffic stop with Deputy Commissioner Marshall. He had avoided watching it for weeks, too ashamed. But now he pressed play. As he watched himself on the screen, the aggressive stance, the dismissive tone, the harsh words, he hardly recognized himself. The man in that video was not who he wanted to be. The next morning, he put on his uniform and drove to police headquarters, ready to face Deputy Commissioner Marshall again. But this time, he was a different officer. Deputy Commissioner Marshall's office looked the same as it had a month ago, but Officer Reynolds felt like a different person walking into it. Elaine was reviewing documents when he entered. She looked up and gestured for him to sit. Officer Reynolds, she said. It's been 30 days. Yes, ma'am, he replied. His hands were steady, his voice calm. I've received reports from Officer Johnson, Elaine continued. She speaks highly of your progress. Mr. Washington from the community center called me personally to share his observations. Even Ms. Garcia sent me a letter. She picked up a handwritten note from her desk. She says you've shown real growth and genuine interest in the community's concerns. Reynolds nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. They're good people. They taught me a lot. And what exactly did they teach you? Elaine asked, leaning forward slightly. Reynolds took a deep breath. They taught me that I had biases I didn't want to admit. That I was treating some people differently based on how they looked or where they lived. You met her eyes directly. They taught me that being a good police officer means serving everyone with the same respect. Elaine studied him for a moment. then smiled slightly. Well said. She stood and walked to the window. Your 30 days of reassignment are over, Officer Reynolds. It's time to decide what happens next. I understand, ma'am. Elaine turned to face him. I'm putting you back on patrol. Reynolds looked surprised. He had expected more desk duty or perhaps a transfer. Thank you, ma'am, he said cautiously. But, Elaine continued, with some changes. You'll be working in the Riverside neighborhood as part of our new community policing initiative, and you'll be helping to train other officers. Train them? Reynolds was shocked. In what? In what you've learned, Elaine explained. The department is implementing new procedures for traffic stops and community engagement. You've experienced both sides now. You understand what needs to change. Reynolds sat straighter in his chair. You want me to help reform the department? Ironic, isn't it? Elaine smiled. The officer who once represented the problem becoming part of the solution. 6 months later, a group of police officers sat in a training room. At the front stood Officer Reynolds and Deputy Commissioner Marshall. On a large screen was a video of Reynolds' traffic stop with Elaine. This, Reynolds told the officers, is how not to conduct a traffic stop. His voice was clear and confident as he pointed out every mistake he had made. I didn't identify myself properly. I didn't state the reason for the stop. I escalated rather than de-escalated. I made assumptions based on appearance. The officers watched attentively, some taking notes. We're implementing new procedures, Elaine added. Every traffic stop will be recorded and reviewed. Officers will be required to state their name and the reason for the stop immediately. And most importantly, all civilians will be treated with the same level of respect, regardless of who they are. After the training session, Reynolds and Elaine walked together down the hallway. The community outreach program is showing positive results, Reynolds reported. Complaints are down 30% since we started. Elaine nodded approvingly. And what about Officer Wilson? I heard he had some resistance to the new procedures. He did at first, Reynolds admitted. But I took him to meet Ms. Garcia and Mr. Washington. They're very persuasive. They reached the front entrance of the building. Outside, a group of officers was heading to their patrol cars. Officer Reynolds, Elaine said as they stopped at the door. What would have happened if I hadn't been a deputy commissioner that day, if I had just been an ordinary citizen? Reynolds considered the question seriously. I like to think someone would have helped me learn these lessons eventually. But honestly, it might have taken something worse happening first. Elaine nodded. Then let's make sure something worse doesn't have to happen to change other officers' minds. Yes, ma'am, Reynolds agreed. One traffic stop at a time.